Small-town America, autumn of 2001. The early morning air carried the last golden leaves drifting off trees lining the cracked sidewalks, and the sky hovered somewhere between soft grey and pale blue, as if reluctant to awaken, just like the sleepy storefronts of Maplewood Avenue, which had yet to pull down their metal shutters. Into that quiet dawn shuffled a slender, unassuming man, his silhouette framed by the glow of a solitary street lamp, baseball cap shadowing his face, a worn canvas sack slung over his shoulder, brimming with emptied aluminum cans and plastic bottles. His daily harvest in a world that overlooked him. He was a fixture, as familiar as the aging bell tower in the Civic Park, yet nameless, referred to politely by a few as the Can Man, avoided by most, and completely invisible to the rest. No one remembered his name. No one bothered to ask. He walked the same route every day, stoop-shouldered and silent, sifting through trash bins, behind the coffee shop, the hardware store, and the post office before the sun had risen enough to chase the dew from the lawns. On this particular morning, the scent of damp earth mixed with the hum of heating systems, kicking on inside houses, and the faint echo of a school bell in the distance. But all that faded into the background the moment he knelt by a recycling bin in front of the elementary school, his fingers brushing the crushed edges of a soda can coated in dew. A voice startled him. "Excuse me, was that in the war?" He froze, his muscles tensing as if bracing against a winter chill, though the air was only mildly cool. Slowly he turned toward the sound, and there stood a boy, 12 years old, slender, bright-eyed, backpack dangling off one shoulder, sneakers dusty from the walk. The boy's gaze was fixed on the man's left forearm, where beneath a worn sweater sleeve lay a long, jagged scar, its edges pale against aged skin. No mockery in the boy's voice, no fear, just simple human curiosity. "Was that in the war?" The man inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs with a memory he'd buried so deep he had nearly forgotten it himself. That single question, innocent yet profound, was the key that unlocked a chest of memories he thought lost. Memories of distant battlefields, of comrades and grief, of survival and exile. In that moment, he realized, this was no ordinary day. It could never be. A school bell chimed again, faint against the swirl of falling leaves and morning routines, but for him, time had slipped sideways. He stood there not as the Can Man, but as a man seen, and it began. If this story moves you as it moved me to write it, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing stories that inspire, touch, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. His name was Edward. Not Ed, not Eddie, just Edward. A name that once echoed through the hardwood hallways of a modest two-story home on the north side of Rochester, New York, where he grew up during the Great Depression in a neighborhood of rail workers, factory hands, and immigrant families who all knew the value of silence, of supper at 6 sharp, and of making things last. And though the war would change everything, there was a time when Edward believed his life would be simple: study hard, fix cars with his father in the garage, marry the girl from 2 blocks down, and grow old under the same elm trees that dropped golden leaves on his front step every October. But in December 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed and the country seemed to hold its breath before roaring into war, Edward, like so many boys his age, didn't hesitate. He left school, lied about his age, and joined the army not for glory, but because the weight of inaction felt heavier than any uniform, and because back then, serving your country felt like the truest way to become a man, even if it meant becoming something else in the process, something harder, something lonelier, something no one could explain until they had stood knee-deep in mud under enemy fire. He trained in the heat of Fort Benning, learned how to leap from plains into foreign fields with a rifle strapped to his chest and a map in his teeth, and by the summer of 1944 he was jumping into Normandy as part of the 101st Airborne. And though the movies would one day turn it into something heroic, something clean and bold and cinematic, the truth Edward remembered was the sound of men vomit, ting from fear, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with blood, and the terrible realization as his boots hit French soil that no amount of training could prepare a person for what war really was. Not just death, but the steady erosion of everything that once made you human. But it wasn't Normandy that left the deepest wound, not physically and not in the way scars are visible. It was what came later, during the long, frozen days of the Battle of the Bulge, when Edward's unit was surrounded near Bastogne, and the forest was so quiet between shellings that he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. And it was there, while dragging the body of a wounded friend across a snow-covered trench, that the shell exploded, sending a hot, searing edge of steel through his left forearm and knocking him off his feet with such force that for a moment he believed he had died and been left behind in that bitter, white silence. He would later describe that moment not in terms of pain, but of absence, the way everything fell away, the way time slowed, the way the snowflakes kept falling, indifferent, onto the faces of the dead and the living alike. And when he woke up, days later, in a field hospital with his arm in a sling and his name misspelled on a clipboard, he knew with a quiet certainty that the man who had MPD from the plane had not survived the war, even if his body had. When he was discharged in 1946 and stepped off the train in Rochester with a Purple Heart in his bag and no family waiting on the platform, his parents both gone by then, his sisters moved to California, his girl married to someone else. He wandered the same streets he had left as a boy, now invisible in the place that had once been home, and though the government gave him a small pension and a letter of thanks, what he really needed, a job, a community, a way back into the world, was nowhere to be found. Over the years, he drifted from job to job, from city to city, sleeping in shelters and under bridges, collecting cans not because he wanted to, but because routine was something to hold on to when you no longer had a name people remembered. And though the scar on his arm healed, though the skin knit itself back together in a jagged, pale line, the silence remained, not just around him, but inside. Him, like a room in which no one had spoken for 50 years. Because what the war left him with, more than the pain, more than the medals, more than the wound, was silence. The silence of being forgotten, the silence of trying to explain something no one asked about, the silence of passing children on the sidewalk who never knew that the man rummaging through their recycling bins had once stood with frost on his lashes, watching friends die in defense of a flag that would never wave for him again. And then, after all that time, after the silence had become so thick and familiar that he mistook it for peace, a boy asked him a question, and everything that had been buried began to stir. His name was Liam, and he was the kind of boy who sat in the back of the classroom, not because he wasn't paying attention, but because he liked to see the whole room, to watch people move, to trace the rhythms of a day not just by the ticking of the clock, but by the way his classmates tilted their heads when they didn't understand something, or the way his teacher, Ms. Parker, sighed at her desk when she thought no one was looking, and even though he was only 12, Liam had the quiet instincts of someone who noticed the things that most people didn't, especially the man who collected cans outside the school every Tuesday and Thursday morning, before the first bell rang and before the hallway filled with footsteps and chatter. It had started as a background detail, a flicker of movement in the periphery of his daily walk, the man's hunched figure, the clinking of bottles in the bag over his shoulder, the way he never spoke, never looked anyone in the eye. But over time, Liam began to wonder, not out of pity or fascination, but out of a deep, inexplicable sense that there was more to this man than the plastic and metal he carried, There was a story written in the way he moved, in the slope of his shoulders, in the quiet grief that clung to him like a shadow. And Liam, who had always asked more questions than his parents could answer, found himself fixated on the long, pale scar that curved along the man's forearm like a forgotten signature. That morning, the one that would change everything, Liam had stayed back a little after first period, claiming to need more time on his math quiz, though the truth was, he just didn't feel like rushing through the crowd of shouting boys and swinging backpacks. So when he finally stepped out the front doors, he saw the man alone, crouched near the recycling bin, gently picking through cans with a kind of reverence that struck Liam as strangely beautiful. And before he could stop himself, before the shyness could take hold, he walked up, cleared his throat and asked, "Was that from the war?" The man didn't answer right away. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, the silence between them stretching long and taut, and Liam felt a flicker of doubt, the kind that comes right after you speak too boldly, too honestly in a world that rarely rewards it. But he held his ground, not out of bravery, but because something in the man's eyes, something old and pained and startled, mad. It impossible to look away. Instead of scolding him or walking off, the man simply nodded just once, and for Liam that was more than an answer. It was an invitation. From that day forward, a ritual began, one unspoken and unrehearsed. After school, 2 or 3 days a week, Liam would sit on the bench near the far corner of the playground, where the grass gave way to the asphalt, and the man, whose name he eventually learned was Edward, would sometimes join him, sometimes not, but always noticed, always nodded, always allowed the space between them to grow into something neither of them had expected. At first, Liam brought a sandwich. Nothing fancy, just turkey and cheese on whole wheat, with a napkin his mom always tucked into his lunchbox even though he never used it, and left it on the bench without a word. Edward never asked, but he never refused, and the small act of sharing became a bridge, the first step in a slow, tender reconstruction of trust. Over time, Edward began to speak, never all at once, never in a rush, but in fragments, as though pulling words from the wreckage of memory, brushing off the dust and offering them to someone who might finally hear them. He spoke of the snow in Belgium, of a letter he never mailed, of friends who didn't come back, of nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why he had been spared and what exactly had been left of him to return. Liam didn't interrupt. He never tried to fill the silences. He just listened, the kind of listening that adults forget how to do, the kind that isn't about responding but about receiving, absorbing, carrying. One afternoon, as golden leaves skated across the parking lot and the sky turned that specific shade of blue that only happens in October, Edward pulled something from his coat pocket, a small folded piece of yellowed paper, the edges worn soft with time, and handed it to Liam without a word. It was the letter, the one he had written to his sister in 1944 and never mailed. Liam read it in silence, the sunlight warming his back, and when he looked up he didn't ask why Edward had never sent it, or if he thought she might still be alive. He just said, "We could find her." Edward laughed, a soft, surprised sound that cracked through the years like a leaf underfoot, and for the first time Liam saw something shift in him, as if a door that had been bolted shut for half a century had opened just wide enough to let in a sliver of light. It didn't happen all at once, the way stories rarely do when they're real, but in the quiet accumulation of details, the slow uncovering of something long buried beneath time, shame, and silence. And it began not with a breakthrough, but with a question scrawled in Liam's notebook, underlined twice in pencil. What if someone is still looking for him? He had written it after reading Edward's old letter for the second time, this time not as a boy trying to understand a war, but as someone beginning to understand what absence meant, what it must feel like to vanish from someone's life with no warning, no explanation, no goodbye. And that question, small and simple as it looked on the page, became the engine that moved everything forward. With the quiet support of Miss Parker, who had always suspected that Liam's quietness hid more depth than distraction, they began to piece together what little they had. The letter, Edward's full name, his birth year, a vague recollection of a sister named Evelyn or Elaine, Edward wasn't sure anymore, and a few towns in upstate New York where he thought his family might have lived before everything fell apart. Ms. Parker reached out to a local historian who volunteered at the public library downtown, and with access to digitized census records, newspaper archives, and old address books, the pieces started falling into place like constellations slowly forming in a night sky. They found a 1930 census entry listing an Edward H. Willard, age 6, with a younger sister named Evelyn, in a house on Jefferson Avenue in Rochester, and that one line, just ink on yellowed paper, was like a key turning in a lock. With every record they uncovered, Liam felt the weight of the years loosen slightly, like knots pulled gently from an old rope. A high school yearbook photo from 1942, showing Evelyn Willard as co-captain of the debate team, a wedding announcement from 1950, a relocation notice to Cleveland, and finally, through a registry of assisted living facilities in Ohio, an address, a real living address, connected to a woman named Evelyn Willard Schmidt, age 84, widow, with one son in California, and a note in her file that said, "Still searching for her brother, missing since '02, never declared deceased." When Ms. Parker shared the news with Edward, he didn't speak for several minutes. He simply held the printout in his hands like it was a piece of bone, an artifact unearthed from the ruins of something sacred. And then, very slowly, he began to weep, not from sadness, not even from relief, but from the unbearable strangeness of being remembered after so long, of learning that someone, somewhere, had never given up on you. He whispered her name, Evelyn, over and over, as if saying it enough times might make up for the decades he hadn't. And Liam sat beside him, saying nothing, holding the letter that had started it all, its paper soft now from the touch of too many hands and too much time. What followed was not a dramatic reunion, not yet. Things like that take care, patience, preparation, but a slow, deliberate process. Phone calls made with trembling fingers, a care home administrator confirming identity with guarded hope, and finally Evelyn's voice on the line, hesitant, aged but firm, asking only one question: does he still have the scar on his left arm? When Mrs. Parker said yes, Evelyn began to cry. Not loudly, not theatrically, but the way people cry when the world finally makes sense again, even if only for a moment. And Edward, hearing her through the speakerphone, pressed his hand to his chest like he could feel her heartbeat through the wire. The next few weeks passed in a strange sort of stillness, the kind that surrounds something momentous that hasn't quite happened yet. And in that time, Liam wrote everything down. Not just what Edward said, but how he said it. Not just the facts, but the feeling. Not just the past, but the way it had shaped every movement of the present. He filled pages with fragments. Edward's dreams about falling snow, his memory of a song Evelyn used to hum while doing dishes, the way his fingers shook when he tried to fold a shirt, the way he flinched when a car backfired. And in those pages, the war took on a different shape. Not a chapter in a textbook, but a living ghost, both terrible and tender, wrapped in the body of a man who had walked among them unseen for years. And as Liam wrote, he began to understand something he hadn't known when he first asked about the scar, that memory is not just what we carry, but what we leave behind in others, that it survives not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts that choose to hold onto us, even when the world lets go. So when the arrangements were finally made, when Evelyn agreed to come to Maplewood, accompanied by her son, who had grown up with stories of an uncle lost in a forest overseas, Liam was ready, not just with words, but with something more rare, the knowledge that sometimes simply caring is enough to change the course of history, even if only for two people. The day Evelyn arrived was one of those bright, brittle mornings in early December, when the cold doesn't bite so much as it holds you, when even the sun seems to shine with restraint, as if wary of interrupting whatever silent ceremony the day might be preparing. And in that morning light, as frost clung to the edges of car windows and the breath of passers-by hung briefly in the air, Edward sat on a bench in Maplewood Park, wearing the same coat he had worn every winter for nearly 20 years, now brushed and buttoned, a scarf around his neck, his hands folded carefully in his lap, as though even the smallest motion might undo something sacred. He had barely slept the night before, not from fear, not even from anticipation, but from the strange foreign presence of hope, which felt heavier than he remembered, as if after so many years of carrying nothing, carrying something good required new muscles. And as he sat there, the wind brushing against his face, he kept reaching into his inner coat pocket, not to check if the letter was still there. He knew it was, but just to feel its weight, to remind himself that it was real, that it had survived, that he had survived. Liam stood nearby, watching quietly, hands in his jacket pockets, the notebook tucked under his arm, unsure if this was the kind of moment he should record or simply witness, but knowing deep down that it was both, that this wasn't just the end of a story, but the beginning of something that had taken a lifetime to reach. And then she appeared, Evelyn, small, silver-haired, supported on one side by her son, and on the other by a cane that tapped gently against the path as they approached, her eyes scanning the benches until they found him. And when they did, she stopped, and for a second no one moved, the air between them suspended like a held breath. She didn't speak right away, she didn't need to. Edward stood, slowly, carefully, as though rising from a place deeper than the bench itself, and when their eyes met, blue and blue, both faded but still bright, something passed between them, something wordless and enormous, and he took one small step forward, then another, and then she let go of her son's arm and reached out, her hand trembling, not with uncertainty, but with the impossible W-8 of recognition. He said her name, Evelyn, softly, like a prayer, like something that had lived in his mouth all these years but had never been spoken aloud, and she nodded, her eyes filling with tears that did not fall, because there was no need to weep now. Not when the moment they had both dreamed of, in separate, quiet corners of the world, had finally taken shape before them. "I never stopped writing to you," she whispered, "and I never stopped hearing you," he replied. They didn't talk about the years apart, not then, not in detail, because what mattered most in that moment wasn't what had been lost, but what had remained. The unspoken bond between a brother and sister, torn apart by a world on fire, reunited not by miracle, but by memory, by a boy who had asked the right question at the right time, and by the quiet, stubborn hope that had refused to die. They sat together for hours, Evelyn and Edward side by side on the bench as the city moved gently around them, talking in the slow, unhurried rhythm of people who no longer needed to rush, who had already waited long enough. They spoke of their parents, of Rochester, of the piano in the living room and the maple tree in the front yard, of a dog named Whiskey, of Christmas mornings and summer CW, hymns and the scent of apple pie cooling on the windowsill. And they spoke of silence too, the years of it, not with bitterness, but with something closer to reverence, as if the silence itself had kept them safe somehow, preserved something fragile until the world was ready to receive it. And as they talked, Liam sat on a low stone wall nearby, scribbling in his notebook, pausing often, not to edit or rethink, but to absorb, to let the moment wash over him, to breathe it in like a cold wind that clears the air. And at one point, Edward turned to him and smiled, really smiled, and said, "You were the one who saw me." Later, before they parted for the day, Evelyn took Edward's hand and said, "I'm not angry you disappeared. I'm only grateful you came back." He looked down at their hands, hers soft, his weathered, and answered, "I didn't know how to be found. And yet," she said, "here you are." No. In the weeks that followed their reunion, something shifted in Edward, not in a dramatic or outwardly visible way, but in the subtle tilt of his shoulders when he walked, in the way he answered questions at the local senior center where he now lived, with the help of a veteran support organization, in the way he no longer avoided mirrors or the sound of his own name. as though being seen had restored some part of him that had once gone missing, and being remembered had returned him to himself. Evelyn visited often, always bringing with her a small box of things she'd saved, a locket, an old photo, a program from his high school graduation, and they would sit by the window of the center's common room, sipping tea and talking not of war, not of politics or regrets, but of everyday things. What they'd eaten for lunch, how the winter felt colder this year, how strange it was to be old together after having spent a lifetime apart. And Liam, now no longer just a curious boy with a notebook, but something closer to a historian, a witness, a keeper of truth, compiled everything he had written into a school essay titled "The Scar That Told the War," which he submitted for a statewide competition on living memory, never expecting it to go far, only hoping that someone, somewhere, would read it and understand. But the story moved people. It reached a journalist, then a filmmaker, then a local station that wanted to feature Edward and Evelyn's story as part of a segment on forgotten veterans. And soon, what had once been a private act of listening became a public reckoning, a reminder that history doesn't only live in museums or textbooks, but in alleyways, in scarred forearms, in the space between two siblings reunited on a bench in a quiet town park. Edward passed away that spring, quietly in his sleep, with Evelyn at his side and the original letter folded in his hands. The same letter he had once carried in his chest pocket through Belgium's snow, now yellowed and fragile, but whole like him. At his memorial, held at the very school where it had all begun, Ms. Parker read Liam's essay aloud to a gymnasium full of students, teachers and neighbors, her voice steady, even as her hands trembled, and when she reached the final line, "Sometimes all it takes to change a life is to ask the question no one else dares to ask." There was a silence in the room that felt sacred. A week later, the school dedicated a small space near the library as the Edward Willard Memorial Room, a place where students could read the essay, see the photos, listen to recorded interviews, and learn that heroism often wears no uniform, that sometimes it collects cans in the cold, and that the most powerful stories are the ones we nearly overlook. And Liam, a little taller now, a little older and still carrying his notebook wherever he went, stood at the dedication ceremony, his eyes fixed on the plaque bearing Edward's name, not as a man lost to history, but as one finally restored to it. We share true stories every day, stories that move, that remember, that matter. Subscribe to our channel and join us.